So we're recording and live.
Good evening, everyone. We'll just allow another minute or so for a few more people to join the Zoom call before we officially start tonight's meeting of the Newburyport Historical Commission. I hope everyone is staying cool in this rather warm weather we're having here today. There's Mr. Sawtell. Good. So let's see, we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. I think we're all here except for Mr. Fay, who said he couldn't join. Is that right, Caitlin?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, then why don't I officially get started here. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Zoom or virtual meeting of the Newburyport Historical Commission for the 27th of July, 2023. Please note that this meeting, like all city virtual meetings, pardon, is being recorded. The very quick note, there's a remote possibility, but still a possibility that tonight's meeting might be interrupted by a loss of power or connectivity or something. National Grid is expecting stormy conditions and they're cautioning, they've got extra crews out, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't think it's likely to happen, but just in case, if the technology crashes because of something like that, any unfinished business will carry to our next meeting. So let me start with a roll call of our commissioners in alphabetical order. We got just confirm you're here, so we'll also test your audio. Andrew Bernhardt.
I'm here.
Okay. Biff Baus.
Here.
Okay, very good. Mark Cindrone.
Present.
Thank you, Mark. Joe Morgan.
Here.
Thank you, Joe. Ed Neumer. I saw Ed, is your audio?
Yeah, I was on mute. I apologize.
Okay, yep, we hear you now, Ed. Thank you. And Chris Sawtell. I saw him. Where's his audio? I think it looks like you're still muted, Chris. Chris Sawtell. Earth calling Chris. If you're talking, you're muted, Chris. But I see you, so I won't hold it up longer, but just try unmuting yourself at some point so we can hear you. Hopefully he can hear me. Oh, there he goes.
Having a bit of audio problem here. I'm trying to get my speakers to work.
Okay, we just heard you just then. Thanks very much for doing that. Okay, well, very good. So the only commissioner absent is Christopher Fay. So Ed, you as our one alternate, you will function tonight as a regular member for tonight's discussion. It's a little bit unusual. This discussion has roots that go way back, but I think it's at this point we can almost consider it a new matter. But anyway, I will introduce it in a moment. So we just have one item on the agenda, one major item, and that's a discussion of the preservation restriction for the old jail. So I'm going to very briefly give a bit of an intro here. I think that would be important both for my fellow commissioners and for anyone out there in the attendees, of which we just have a couple. Anyway, do we have oh, good. Jeff Rollos is there. Good. Okay. So briefly, in 2019, a zoning variance was sought to resolve some awkward lot boundaries over by the old jail, the applicant being Chuck Griffin, who is still our applicant. And the Zoning Board of Appeals made, as part of their determination, the requirement for a preservation restriction on the various historic properties there, those being the old jail itself, the keeper's house, the stable, and other things, walls, and so on. So this would be the, quote, public benefit. The public benefit was that the jail, keeper's house, the former stable, and several granite walls would be forever preserved for posterity. So the applicant gets more advantageous lot boundaries and in return gives up certain, quote unquote, property rights to the city. But there are two complications to this particular PR that add complexity. The first is that the PR must cover several structures over several lots. I think there are 4. And secondly, the applicant asked for and was granted back in 2019 the right to make certain changes or to exempt, certain bits and pieces and so forth, most of which were driven by the unique nature of these buildings, particularly the jail structure. As one quick example, the jail had very heavy iron bars and lack of, actual useful windows. So an occupancy in that structure was totally out of the question. So the NHC agreed that the bars could be removed and stored on site, so that actual working windows could be installed and make the place as just one of several things to make the structure habitable. So the idea here is that we were basing this permission on was that it was reasonable to allow some alterations to make the building usable and not just be a granite landmark sitting there without any other use. So let me now briefly go over some of the chronology, not all of it because it's extensive. So I have various crafts that I meant to say various drafts. So various drafts of a preservation restriction were reviewed back in 2019, starting in the spring and into the summer. And one was given what you might call conditional approval by the Newburyport Historical Commission in August. And but that one was not acceptable for the Mass Historical Commission for various reasons, and it got sent back to be redone. But it kind of sat more or less dormant until early in 2022, maybe late in 2021, when the applicant hired attorney Jeff Roloffs to take on the task of rewriting it. And Jeff has been working on it quite assiduously, especially recently. And there's been emails and meetings back and forth. And myself, Mr. Roloffs, Chuck Griffin, Andy Port, and Caitlin have also met over this. And I should mention that the board did authorize me as chair to work separately with the applicant, that's Chuck Griffin, to and his attorneys to work through this rather than have to come to the commission for every little detail. But then when we finally got it where we thought it was presentable, to bring it back before the commission, which is where we are tonight. So Andy Port, city planner, Caitlin, myself met with Jeff Roloff, so you'll hear from in a moment. Chuck Griffin, that's the owner / applicant, last May, and there was some changes that we had to make to the basic agreement back then. And then I should also mention that on June 10th of this year, most of the members, in fact, of the Historical Commission, Christopher Fay was the only one who couldn't make it. He's also absent tonight. Anyway, we were given a tour of the jail properties so that we could better understand what was being proposed and the whys and wherefores, because most of the people that are currently on the commission were not there back when this all started. So that pretty much brings us up to where we are today. My goal, and I think it meshes pretty much with the applicant's goal, is to review the current draft PR and either secure a vote of approval from the commission, either tonight or in the future, but that satisfactorily conforms to the intent of that restriction of 2019 that we agreed to, or if not, work out any specific revisions that need to be made to get to that goal in the nearest possible future. That's how I would put it. And I would point out in that line, as before, even after we give it the okay, it has to go back to the Mass Historical Commission for their review, and they are quite thorough as well. And they'll make sure everything is perfectly done, because it's to make it an agreement that will be in perpetuity. And the last thing I'll mention before turning it over to Jeff is that I know that there are a couple of items that I expect we'll need to discuss, because I'm pretty sure they are. Well, let me back up just a second. One of the problems with the original draft that this draft attempts, and I think mostly successfully, to correct, is there was some vague language that needs to be more specific, things around landscaping and so forth. But there are some things that, if they were vague, exactly how they were specified in this newest draft may or may not create problems. We'll see in a moment. But I know I think they tend to be around the keeper's house, around the windows, dormers, and quote unquote open landscaping around that structure. So I'm sure that there'll be some discussion about that. So that's pretty much what I wanted to say to introduce everything. Let's see, Jeff, it looks like Caitlin, can you unmute Mr. Olofs? And Jeff, you'll need to unmute yourself on your end, and we'll let you make your introduction. My plan is to have you make your introductory remarks now, Jeff, and then I think there might be one or more people who would like to make a public comment. We'll permit that, and then we'll have our deliberation and more detailed discussion. Okay, hopefully that procedural is okay with everybody. So,
Great. Okay, thank you. Really appreciate that introduction. I'm Jeff Roloffs with offices at 44 Merrimack Street in Newburyport. Sitting with me here is Chuck Griffin, here primarily to answer questions, although I will just point out that nobody, I think, knows the history of this jail complex any better than Chuck. He's put a lot of his soul and energy into this complex and into the historical aspects of it. So, Mr. Chairman, if I might share my screen, I was going to get us oriented to the property quickly. I think I could do that once you stop sharing your screen, or I don't know, Caitlin, if it's you that has. There we go.
oh, okay. Thanks, Caitlin. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
Caitlin, and it looks like she's already accomplished the task.
All right, here we go. Okay, great. And if anyone wants me to zoom in at any point in time, just let me know. I thought I would just get us oriented to the property. And this image that you're looking at is on page 19 of the PDF PR that I sent in to the commission. And I thought I'd start with this. It's important because as I was working through this PR and trying to identify what parts of the buildings are protected and not protected, et cetera, the property is oriented in a way that's sort of tricky in terms of knowing what you mean when you say, for example, the northwest wall of the stable house or whatever. So just for your sake, if you were to be able, if you could screenshot this or have a copy of this available to you, that makes it easier as you work your way through the PR. I'm not going to go through the PR word for word, obviously, it's massive, right? But I am going to go through it. And if I'm assuming that everyone has had a chance to review it, at least in a cursory way. But so this is a view of the jail complex. We've got Vernon Street here, Auburn Street. The mile is off to the right. North is to the top of this image. So you've got the keeper's house in the corner. You've got walls that surround the jail building, which is the property in yellow. And then these high stone walls with spikes go around the jail property, and they come into 3 Vernon Street, which is Chuck and Jillian's residence over here. It's only the courtyard portion of that residential property that's being bound up through this preservation restriction, and specifically as related to the high granite walls with spikes that run around this courtyard. And then over here on Vernon Street, 1 Vernon Street, is the old carriage house or stable building, as we've been referring to it. You can see there's a connector building in between the keeper house and the stable building. That's sort of a newer addition, and it's not going to be part, you'll see, of what's being preserved here. So it's basically 3 buildings: the keeper's house, the jail, and the stable building. And then you've got the stone walls around the outside. And then you're right, Glenn, we'll talk about the landscaping questions that come up, primarily is related to this area in front of the keeper's house. These are some visuals also within the PR itself. They're on page 20. We thought these are just helpful to you, but also future owners and future commissioners who are going to be trying to understand and apply this PR. So not perfect accuracy, but it shows the jail. It's oriented a little differently, which is why you sort of, every time you look at a different image, you kind of need to reorient yourself. But in this picture, you've got the jail building. This dash line is the addition that was approved in 2019 has since been built. The keeper house up here, the connector building over to the stable building, and then this courtyard with the stone walls that run around it and the jailhouse right out to the corner of the keeper's house. The coloring on this figure at the bottom identifies the parcels. And this is the parcel configuration that was approved by way of that 2019 variance that you mentioned. It's a logical way to carve up this property. Prior to getting that variance, for example, this courtyard spanned all 4 properties. The jail building itself was just an accessory sort of shed type structure to the keeper's house. So the configuration as it was historically in place just didn't make a lot of sense, which is why they went forward with that process for getting a variance to establish more logical lines. And then this is the plan on record. We don't need to get into that, but I just wanted you to know that it was there. The procedural history, I was going to cover it, but I think you've already covered it. So I appreciate you doing that. And I think I'll just dive right into the PR itself. The PR, roughly 90 pages, that doesn't even include Exhibit F. It's a really complicated preservation restriction as compared to the others in Newburyport. And I don't know how long each of you have been on the commission, but if you go to the commission's website, you can get access to all the other PRs that have been recorded here in Newburyport. And what you'll find is that I think what we've put together here is it's more robust than most of them. It's more detailed than most of them, but it follows the same basic structure. And as Glenn mentioned, in 2019, we had done we being Chuck and his previous developer team, had prepared a PR that they presented to the ZBA and to the Historic Commission. And then after conditional approval of that, it was sent to the MHC. And Michael Steinitz at the Mass Historic Commission reviewed it, sent back a letter a few months later and basically said, you got to redo this, and we want you to do it in the same format that all the other Newburyport PRs are done. There are certain provisions in these PRs we like to see. We've already worked through it. So I want you to redo this PR and stick to the format that we've already worked through for Newburyport, and which is similar to other municipalities across the state. So that was part of my task, was to take that previous PR and then sort of redo it in the format and structure of these other Newburyport PRs. The other thing that happened before we started working on this was a hearing that we had with the Historic Commission in 2021. So at that point, we still had this PR in a draft form. Chuck and Jillian were going ahead with city official approvals with a lot of the work that had been approved back in 2019. But there were some changes that he wanted to make, primarily focused on sort of landscaping and screening associated with the keeper's house. And there was some question as to whether or not those details were allowable under the PR. So we came to the commission in May of 2021. And it was, I want to be respectful in the way I say this, but it was I've been in front of a lot of boards over my 30 plus years of practice, and it was one of the most sort of discouraging meetings that I had been to, probably top 10. It was a really difficult meeting, I found, and I think a lot of it stemmed from the language in the original PR. There were internally inconsistent provisions. There were some provisions that sort of had terms that were undefined, and it being interpreted by some people dramatically different than how it was being interpreted by other people. So one of my objectives here in writing this was to try to put better clarity on what's protected and what's not protected. I've worked with Michael Steinitz on parts of this. He's with the state, if you're not familiar with him, with respect to the structure and the exhibits and all of that. And with respect to the details of the restrictions, his guidance on that was, that's between you and the local historic commission. And what a preservation restriction protects and doesn't protect, it varies. It varies depending on the context, the town, the purposes, etc. So there's no mandate that you do certain things. It's an agreement that the landowner and the Newburyport Historical Commission are negotiating to impose on the property and future owners in perpetuity. So I've tried really hard through my efforts with Glenn, Andy, Caitlin, and the state over the last couple of years to really try to put some clarity on what actually is being protected here, what would require, what's not allowed, what would require future approval by the conservation or by the historical commission, and what kinds of activities don't, for example. So with that little intro, let me just walk through the structure here quickly. And if there's any particular section you want me to stop at and focus in on, please let me know. But basically, you start out with the parties and a bunch of whereas provisions at the top, setting the stage, providing the factual background for the restriction itself. And it's in this where we identify some of the terms, we identify the structure of the exhibits and what's attached to the PR. And again, remember that we're writing this so that when a future owner is trying to understand what they can and can't do, they can read this and understand it without having to hire a lawyer every time they're doing it. So we try to keep the language as simple as we can on the one hand. On the other hand, a lot of this language is boilerplate language that comes from other PRs in Newburyport and elsewhere.
Hey,
So,
Jeff.
Yep.
Pardon the interruption. Just two things.
Yeah.
One thing on that meeting you referenced, I had it down as back in January of 2021, but that's beside the point. The other thing I wanted to say is, let's in discussing this, we probably should say it's not a question of what is permitted and not permitted. It's a question of what's permitted without approval versus requiring review and approval. So another, because I want to, I think it's important for everyone to keep in mind that when things are prohibited or not prohibited, or things that are protected or, let's say there's a historical feature that's protected and there's a proposal to make some change that's other than just, fixing a minor chip or something like that, that's, obviously just maintenance or something. It's not necessarily prohibited, but it needs to be reviewed, and the commission can choose to approve it or not. And an example was back in, I think it was in 2020, Chuck had a problem where he needed to repair a section of roof, and it was a fairly major thing, and it was outside what was in the draft PR because of the materials he wanted to use. But we took it up before the commission and we reviewed it, and it was approved, and he went ahead. So so I just want people to be aware of that, because I don't want I think it helps lessen the sense of an adversarial type of relationship.
Yeah, it's a good point. Thank you. So getting back to the whereas provisions, there's a discussion about what the jail complex is. There's a reference to the Form B, the Historical Commission Inventory Form B for the properties, which is attached as an Exhibit D. There's a reference here to Exhibit E, which is it's a narrative with photos of the historical and recent alterations. That's something that Chuck put together. We thought it'd be worthwhile to put a detailed photographic history together here, so that this is going to be recorded at the registry. It's just a good piece of historical documentation. And then it talks about the fact that these buildings are identified as contributing resources to the Newburyport Historic District, and points out some of this language again is boilerplate, but there's reference to the preservation values and the protected features, and all of these things get spelled out in more detail as you get into the document. You get through the whereas provisions, and then you get to a structured set of requirements. These follow the structure of all the other Newburyport PRs. I don't know how much you've all had a chance to work on those, but it starts out with a purpose section. And the purpose of the restriction is to assure that the architectural, historic, and cultural features of the exterior of the buildings and properties, namely and more particularly the protected features identified in Exhibit G, will be retained and maintained forever, substantially in their current form or current condition. And Exhibit G, by the way, is the document that provides sort of the real details as to what's protected and the extent of protection, and what types of activities will trigger commission review. So that's just a purpose statement. And then there's the preservation restriction itself. The grantors, current owners are granting to the grantee, that's you and the city, the right to forbid or limit on these properties any alteration of the appearance, materials, workmanship, condition, or structural stability of the protected features of the buildings or properties unless you fall into one of these categories. So again, that paragraph is similar to other paragraph 2s in the Newburyport structure. And then these exceptions sort of vary from PR to PR. There are differences if you review the different PRs between some of the buildings like the Custom House or the Kelly School as compared to some of the residential properties that have PR restrictions on them. The grantors there's a covenant here to maintain the property subject to the casualty provisions of paragraphs 9 and 10 or is otherwise permitted by the grantee. This obligation to maintain shall require replacement, rebuilding, repair, and reconstruction of the protected features whenever necessary. So long-term maintenance obligations. And then there are certain prohibited activities. These are, they're spelled out here. And these are actually prohibited. These aren't items that can be reviewed and approved by the commission. These are the sets of actually prohibited activities.
Right.
Different than the point was.
Yeah. And I'll agree with you, Jeff. Those are virtually identical to what we see in pretty much all the PRs.
Right. And then paragraph 5. I'm not going to go through every paragraph, by the way, but this is the meat of it. Paragraphs 1 to 6. So paragraph 5, conditional rights requiring grantee approval, and that goes to your point, Glenn, about pointing out the fact that there are certain things that you just cannot do without first going to the commission. And then we'll get into that in more detail once we get to Exhibit G, because there's more guidance on that there. And then paragraph 6, reserve rights, not requiring further approval. And I don't want to, I'm trying to avoid having to read this, but there are certain things that the landowners will be allowed to do out here, including things defined as minor activities. Those are defined more clearly in Exhibit G, that they won't have to go to the commission for. Right.
Yeah, exhibit, sorry to interrupt you again. A couple of quick things just for the benefit of mostly for my fellow commissioners. One of the things, because of the complexity that Jeff alluded to, in this particular PR, it was determined the best course of action would be to create these. There's a lot of exhibits, I don't know if I go FG, I think there might even be an H anyway, but it was deemed actually make it easier to read, to have the basic core of the PR and then all the details spelled out, grouped together in these various exhibits, as we'll get to. And one other quick point I wanted to make is that most PRs deal only with exteriors. In this case, particularly in the case, well, I think only in the case of the actual jail building, there's also some interior things that are protected, and you'll see those are all spelled out.
Yeah, that's right. And I will also point out, there is a focus on all preservation restrictions and even historic districts. I was reading through some of the MHC guidance today on the protection of external features, and there's one component I just want to highlight to that. And the focus of this protection are those portions of exterior features that are visible from public viewing location, public ways. Mm-hmm. That's the focus of most of the standards that apply to historic districts and preservation restrictions. Okay, so the remaining portions of this I'm not going to get into, but there's a whole series of provisions, again, pulled from the other PRs, modified to sort of cover the fact that we're dealing with multiple properties here and otherwise sort of tailored to these properties. So obligations on the future owners, and future owners are going to just have to, it's going to take an effort on their part to read through this, understand it, and appreciate the burden that this imposes on them.
Yeah. And it's interesting in that it occurred to me just tonight, Jeff, that future owner could be owners, in that where it is separate lots, and the jail, for example, is on its own lot now. that could be one owner, and the Keeper's House complete could be different owners, and the 3 Vernon Street could be yet another set of owners, and who knows?
Yeah, that's right. So, like a lot of neighborhoods, there may be some self-enforcement among those owners. But obviously the PR gives this historical commission and the city enforcement authority over these issues. That's the objective. So getting to the list of exhibits, here's the list. Again, this is following the structure of other PRs, but I walked through this with Michael Steinitz before we pulled these together. Legal property description, that's something yet to be, we're still working on that, and we're going to propose to finalize that while MHC is doing their review. I'll get to that at the end. There's a site plan attached as Exhibit B, the assessor's parcel, which is the image that and the visual representation that I started with this evening. Exhibit D is the Historic Commission Inventory Form B. I'll turn to that in a minute. Exhibit E is the historical and recent alterations narrative that Chuck prepared. Exhibit F, baseline conditions, which I sent to you separately after sending you this PR. That's basically photographs of the existing conditions with labels so you can understand what they are. Exhibit G are the restrictions. Exhibit H, the ZBA 2019 variance decision. And then there were certain alterations that were approved by the commission in 2019 that are identified in Exhibit I. And I noticed today that I had a couple of those things out of order, so we'll be fixing that as we move forward with the next iteration of this. But let me just jump to the Form B, just to give you sort of a flavor. And I'm doing this partly as I walk through the next couple exhibits. I want to highlight some of the vegetation in these photographs, because the vegetation associated with the Keeper's House is one of the topics that we really got hung up on in 2021. And at that time, the commission actually, among other things that were being proposed at that time, I don't want to sort of rehash it, but just as an example, there was a short hedge that Chuck had proposed to put along the bottom of this stone wall along Vernon Street, because there's like the building foundation is crumbling and it doesn't look good. He wanted to put a short hedgerow in front of that, and the commission denied it. And that's when we realized and they denied it based on the language that was in that previous PR, which was partly what highlighted the need to modify the language and clarify some things. So this is the Form B. This is a picture, I think it's 1980, well, this says 81. So you can see in 1981, you've got a tall evergreen tree in the corner. You've got arborvitaes or similar type shrubs right in front of the Keeper's House. Ivy right up to the roof, both sides of the building. I know that that's not a picture of the building and the property in its historic state, but certainly in more recent times, and at a time when they thought it was of significance in the state it was in, worthy of protecting through this inventory. I'm not going to spend too much time on Exhibit E, although I think it's a great read, and I hope that you've had the chance to go through it in detail. There's a lot of interesting information here, and I'm just going to quickly go through some of it, highlight a couple pictures. So again, Chuck put this together. Chuck's done a huge amount of research on the jail complex, partly out of interest, but partly because as he's been renovating and revitalizing these buildings, he's tried to do it in a way that respects the history of it. So he's spent a lot of time digging through archives and talking to a lot of people and suppliers to do things right. But so here's Exhibit E is basically a history that Chuck put together, going back to 1822 when they decided to build the prison yard, the footprints of the original jail, pictures from the 1800s. Correct me if I'm wrong on any of this, Chuck. This is one of the earlier photographs, 1837. So that you can see in this photograph, the Keeper House, the jail building, and then this is the mile. I think what's missing are a lot of the walls. I don't know if that's the stone walls, but and then just more historical photographs and some narrative based on the research that was done. Again, Keeper's House, this is back in the 1800s, early 1900s. You know, they've got some vegetation in front. vines along the front of the keeper's house. Street trees have always been out there. This is part of the jail building. There was an addition behind the jail building at one point that was later removed. Again, look at the,
Yeah, by the way, Jeff, that last picture was a great example of the problem I was pointing out with the windows.
oh yeah. And I mean, Chuck could talk to you for at least an hour about the work that they did to
I'm sure.
take these out to preserve these features in the on-site, in the basement of the jail building, et cetera. We won't get into all that. But again, there's a lot of vegetation on the keeper's house. These are historical photos, not from the 1980s, but 1800s and early 1900s. Shrubbery in front of the keeper's house, but here's the jail building, stone wall with spikes. Keeper's house again, shrubs in front. Getting later in time, this is the courtyard. You know, I mean, basically at this point, the jail's it's not being used as a jail anymore, right? It's being used probably for storage. But here's the keeper's house from the Vernon Street side of it, completely covered in vines, consistent with the historical keeping of the house. This is a picture from '87, which is when Chuck and Jillian bought the property. So that's what it looked like. That's pretty similar to the picture that was in the inventory Form B. And by the way, no one's proposing this kind of vegetation currently, so I should point that out. There is an effort, and it's reflected in this PR, to put some serious constraints on what can be planted there with the goal of preserving views to the building. But these are pictures of work that Chuck and Jillian did on the property to restore it over the years that they've been there. I mean, I think I love this because if you go up there, this is the stable building, right?
Yes,
This is where Chuck's architectural firm has been, and if you know, it's just night and day, right? It's a great example of high quality preservation, restoration. The roofs, you put slate on the buildings.
Yes.
What was there previously?
Two of them, the only building that had slate was the jail when we arrived and when I arrived. And I'm the one that put the slate on the keeper's house and put it on the carriage house. They'd been wood shingles early, and then later they were asphalt shingles.
So I wanted to mention that just because so you know, some of the effort here is to identify what actually is there that has the historic, what are the historic elements and what are the elements that have been added later and aren't actually of historic value, even though they add to the aesthetics of the place, and complement the historic elements that are still there. So when you get a chance, if you haven't already, it's worth reading through this in greater detail. Again, I don't want to spend too much time on it, but you can see that Chuck and Jillian have put a huge amount of work into restoring these properties. And these are more recent pictures. So after 2019, after the previous PR form was approved conditionally, and when it went off to the state for review, the Historic Commission and city officials authorized Chuck to go ahead with the alterations that had been approved. And that work was done, as well as other enhancements in the courtyard, as you can see here. And then there were some improvements that were made to the keeper's house, in the front of the keeper's house. And these actually were the subject. These changes here were part of the changes that sort of brought us back to coming in front of the commission in early 2021. So that's the history. The baseline conditions, Exhibit F, again, I sent that to you separately. Here it is. I don't know if you've had a chance to review it. I don't want to spend too much time on it. The objective of this exhibit, like this exists for all other PRs in Newburyport, is just to document the baseline condition of the property. So I started with an aerial just to get everyone, future readers of the PR, oriented to the properties. And then, sorry, let me just get this into that. So Then we walked through each property. We took photographs and we labeled them so you can understand what's there. So 1 Vernon Street, this is the old stable building. This is where Chuck's offices have been for many years now. This is the connector building that runs over to the keeper's house. You were out there, so you're familiar with these. But these are the pictures that we selected. If you go through this and you think we're missing something, or you want to change, swap out pictures for different pictures, you know, let us know. But we thought
Sorry, Jerry, about what year was that connector built?
I'm sorry.
the connector building, when was that built?
Approximately?
I built that in 88.
88, okay. Okay, just for context. Yeah, go ahead.
Yep. And then this is just coming around the stable building, you know, so this is the front, walking around the side, and then walking around. So this is the back of the stable building, the connector building. Again, that's the back side that faces the courtyard. And then here's the beginning of, so 3 Vernon Street is part of the PR because of these walls and these spiked walls that run around the courtyard. So to the extent that those are on the 3 Vernon Street property, that property is going to be bound by this PR. So that's why that property is in here. The rest of the property happens to be Chuck and Jillian's residence, and that's not going to be subjected to the PR.
Right.
It's not as
Right. and
right.
nor is that a historic structure, correct?
Yeah, exactly. That's right. So these are just pictures of the walls from different perspectives. There's a gate that runs between the courtyard and the neighbor. More pictures of the walls. These are pictures of the walls actually on the jail property, between the jail property and 12 Auburn Street. And then we go over to the keeper's house. I feel like I missed something here. Oh, maybe not. All right, so those are the walls. The keeper's house, 10 Auburn Street. Actually, as I'm looking at this, sorry, every time I go through this, I see something. So 3 Vernon Street, these walls are actually those portions that are behind.
That's the other side.
These are behind the jail building. So I should move those photographs to the baseline photos associated with the jail property. That's what confused me. So I'll do
Well,
that.
they're on the other property. They're on the adjoining property.
Right, because
the
12 Auburn
protected
Street is
wall-
the one
The
down on the
protected
other,
walls are on.
On 12 Auburn.
right, which
I
is
don't know.
down by Railroad Ave there, right?
This part, it's the same wall, but
Yeah.
there's only vines right now on one side, and the vines are just coming over on the other side. The bottom 2 pictures are actually the same wall on the south side.
All right, so I have to confirm if those walls are in the. I thought they were part of the
Yeah, the
jail.
walls-
They're on the jail property. They're protected.
Yes, they're protected. They
Okay.
are on the jail property.
Okay. All right.
But you see them from the other side.
Yeah. You
I'm
see them
sorry.
from 12 Auburn.
You're
right.
correct.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah,
All right. So this is the keeper's house. Obviously, front view from Auburn Street, looking up the sidewalk up towards the building, and then just coming around and looking at what we think is the prominent view of this building is this view here from the corner. If you were back towards the roadway, High Street, or over at the courthouse, your view is not this direct view. It's more this view here, where you can sort of see both of the walls. And you can see now it's obviously in a much more barren state than what it was in those historic photos. There's basically no plantings at all in front of this building currently. And it was this wall, this bottom foundation where Chuck had wanted to put in some plantings a couple of years ago, and the commission didn't want him to. So that's going to be the subject. I mean, we try to address that topic in the PR that we sent to you. That's in front of you. This is a zoomed in picture of just the patio area in front of the keeper's house. And I should note, I didn't pull it up, but the variance that was approved, it approved a plan. I could go to it if you have any questions about it, but it approved an easement from Vernon Street in front of the keeper's house through this gate to serve the jailhouse. It was a parking and driveway access easement, I think 9 feet wide. So the idea here was to build sort of a divider between what could be, if the owners wanted to, what could be a driveway into the jail building and the area in front of the keeper's house where the residential occupants would be spending time. And then as we move around the keeper's house towards the stable building, this is coming from Vernon Street. That's the back of the keeper's house.
Yeah, unless anyone be puzzled by that, they think the explanation for that easement is simple, being that it was a jail, it was surrounded by a high wall, so that the person, if you're living there, you had no way to even get to the street essentially, except by, you know, going that gate, you know, led to the other person's, you know, the keeper's property. So
Right.
that's what that was all about.
Right.
And I think there is a, correct me if I'm wrong, either Chuck or Jeff, that I think there is a pre-approved provision for an opening in the front of that wall, should that ever be decided upon.
There
Is that
is.
okay?
There is. So part of Exhibit I goes into what was approved previously. And one of
Okay.
the things is, this is from inside the courtyard, and this is the keeper's house on the left. So currently there's that stone wall with spikes is right here. And so the commission approved in 2019 that stone wall be replaced with a gate, so that these occupants could come out this back door and then out to the front through that gate. That was one of the things that was approved. So it's an Exhibit I. But continuing through Exhibit F, this is from the courtyard side of the keeper's house, just a view back, and then straight on the back of the keeper's house. Here's that stone wall to the right. There's the area we were just talking about, but these are existing conditions again. And then we get to the jail. So different photographs of the jail. This is from the Auburn Street side, just a close-up photograph of the jail building itself. Stepping back across Auburn Street and looking back up, we've got these lower granite walls and upper granite walls with spikes, both to be protected through the PR on the jail property. Another picture of the lower granite walls that run parallel to Auburn Street. And then we get to the northeast side of the jail building, which is the side that faces the keeper's house. So perpendicular to Auburn Street. The courtyard is back here to the right. Here is the courtyard side of the jail building in its current state. Here's the addition that was constructed pursuant to the approval of the ZBA and the Historic Commission in 2019, and a closer picture of that addition. And that's documented as well in the historical narrative in Exhibit E. Coming around that addition, to the Auburn Street side of the jail, there's the addition, and here's the jail building. And here's some sort of an artistic feature that Chuck put in the back of the windows that he took out of the jail building. But so as part of his renovations of the jail building, he had a condition arise that he hadn't thought about ahead of time, which was that given it's a very challenging thing to run ductwork and the like through this jail building, given that it's made of 3-foot granite blocks or whatever, right, Chuck? I mean, you can get into it. We don't need to get into the details of it, but he had to run these vent pipes up to this flat roof on the southwest side of the jail building. And to protect those from getting buried in snow, he built this little snow deflector on there. And I just wanted to point that out because that's mentioned in the PR that's in front of you as something that's allowed. All right, so those are the baseline conditions. Sorry, we haven't even gotten to the meat of it. This is the meat of the restrictions. And Exhibit G starts with an overview. And again, when I wrote this, I wrote it thinking that it's going to be read by a future owner who may not have any knowledge of what a preservation restriction really is and what is this document doing. And so I tried to write this in a way that just laid out the structure of what they were about to read and explained what this PR is trying to accomplish. And so it starts by explaining that in this Exhibit G, number one, it identifies the features of the buildings and properties that are protected by the restriction. So these are the so-called protected features. It also identifies existing features that are not protected. The existing features not protected. I'm trying to keep it simple. The restrictions and guidelines also specify the extent to which the protected features are regulated by the restriction and when the Commission's prior review of proposed alterations is required. These restrictions and guidelines are supplemental to the other provisions within the PR. But basically speaking, these are this is the meat of what's protected and what would require review by the commission. For each property, we go property by property. There's a narrative set of provisions that explains and identifies the protected features with some exceptions, what's allowed, what kinds of changes are allowed for some of those protected features. They identify the existing features that are not protected, so you don't have to worry about changing those features. And then for the protected features, it identifies specifically what's protected with some exceptions. And this just explains what's going on. It goes on to explain that for each property, we've got visual guides here. Visual guides were done by Chuck and his team to help these future owners decipher the narrative provisions, because it starts to look like legalese if you get into it too much. So the visual aids were an attempt to make it easier to understand what's going on here. The extent of the protection provision here, this language is what Glenn, you were talking about before. Basically, where you're proposing to do something to a protected feature, you need to identify if it's a minor change, a minor alteration, or ordinary maintenance, which wouldn't require historical commission review, or if it's a major alteration. This language comes out of the guidelines for every PR out there. It's a little bit different because I tried to simplify it and tailor it here. But if you go to the PR for the Kelly School or Custom House or the Goodwin House, you'll see that they have an exhibit. It changes from PR to PR that also has guidelines. And at the end of their guidelines, there's a similar paragraph. So let me just go to one of those quickly. So the guidelines, this is for the Goodwin House. What is it? Sorry, just so you know, for reference, what I'm looking at here. The property at 223 High Street. They've got baseline photos. I think ours are better, but just to give you a sense for what others look like, these are the baseline photos for that house. You can see all the vegetation that that are in that baseline condition. And then they have these guidelines. Now these guidelines are pretty similar from PR to PR. For these properties, they look a little different. And it's partly because most of the buildings here, these guidelines don't really apply well to these buildings, which are granite block buildings and not the kind that people are painting. It's not, the windows and doors there aren't historical elements that are covered by these typical guidelines. So the standard guidelines don't really apply well, which is why we prepared our own. But this narrative at the end of the guidelines, which you'll see in every PR out there, is important. And I basically took that language and carved it into our PR and elaborated on it to clarify what it was intended to do. So changes classified as major alterations are not necessarily unacceptable. Actually, up earlier on, it explains, if it's a minor change, you don't have to go to the commission. And it's the landowner in the first instance that determines whether or not it's minor or major. If they have any doubts about it, they should go to the commission or the planning office and talk to them about it. Because if they think it's minor and then they're wrong, and then the historical commission thinks it's actually major, then they've got a little bit of a problem on their hands. But all these PRs in Newburyport put it on the landowner in the first instance to decide whether or not their proposed activity is a minor routine maintenance type thing, or if it's a major thing that might require that would require the commission's review. If it's a major alteration, this narrative applies. Changes classified as major alterations are not necessarily unacceptable. In fact, approval of such changes shall not be unreasonably withheld. Under the preservation restrictions, such changes must be reviewed by the commission and their impact on the historical integrity of the building assessed. It is the responsibility of the property owner to notify the commission in writing when any major alterations are contemplated. Substantial alterations may necessitate review of plans and specs. The intent of the preservation restriction is to enable the commission to review proposed alterations and assess their impact on the integrity of the structure, not to preclude future change. The commission will attempt to work with property owners to develop mutually satisfactory solutions that are in the best interest of the property. All right.
If I can give you a good example of this, so that would apply to the jail. Let's say that he's got slate roofs. Let's say a slate, falls off. Anyone who's got a slate roof knows that occasionally happens. So you're going to replace, if the slate is not damaged, you can simply replace the slate. That's a minor change. You don't need any approval to do that. That's considered normal repair and maintenance, and in kind and so on. However, if let's say in this case Chuck said, oh, I want to re-roof, I want to rip the roof off, replace the deck because maybe it's rotted, and re-roof it with something, that's a major change, and that would have to be reviewed. Does that help at all?
Yep. I think that's good. So I just wanted to point to this language from another PR, and it's very similar from PR to PR. All of the guidelines attached to these PRs have similar language, because that's basically what we're doing here in this extent of protection paragraph. And I'm not going to read the whole thing, but that's basically what we're saying now. So if you read through it, you'll see that it follows most of the same language. The continued applicability of other ordinances and requirements paragraph here was inserted recently at Glenn's suggestion. And I didn't think it was necessary, because I never understood a PR would somehow hand tie the historical commission or exempt. It's not something that exempts the property owners from any other requirements. The preservation restriction adds obligations and restrictions on top of any other restrictions that might be out there. So if somebody wants to put a dormer on one of these roofs, even if this preservation restriction provides that it's on a roof pitch that's not regulated by this restriction, and it doesn't require further any historical commission review, that doesn't mean they don't have to go get their zoning approval if it triggers a zoning requirement. So this paragraph just makes it clear. Nothing in this restriction should be interpreted as limiting or affecting the applicability of any ordinances, laws, or other requirements that may apply to proposed activities at these properties. For example, activities that this restriction allows without the commission's prior approval must still comply with any applicable requirements of Newburyport zoning ordinance or any other zoning ordinance. So if you have authority over some future activity here that you have independent of this preservation restriction, you would still have that authority. So we're not trying to pull that away from you. Okay, what do we got here? Oh, sorry, that's the photo key. I was wondering why we went right straight to a visual aid. So this is a photo key to the properties to help the future owners and you and the future commission members understand where each photograph that you'll see in these visual aids, where it was taken from and what it's portraying. So we didn't use the same photographs in the baseline conditions, although we probably could have. We thought it would be more helpful to have more current ones. But these visual aids actually also provide documentation of recent conditions. All right, so the narratives. Now, I'm assuming that you've had the opportunity to walk through these. I'm not going to walk through every bullet point. We'll be here all night. I'm happy to focus in on anything you want me to. But basically, for every property, we start with number one and identifying the protected features. For each protected feature, or not all of them, but for many of them, we're identifying the feature as protected, but we're also exempting certain types of activities. So these would be activities that you could do without having to come back to the commission. So, for example, 1A, for the stable building, this is at 1 Vernon Street. The existing granite foundation, so this is identifying what is a protected feature. The existing granite foundation and stone walls of the stable building, with exception for the following. So, new and modified window and door openings on those sides not facing Vernon Street, etc. Maintenance of vines and vine support structures. And we go on to identify certain things that, despite the fact that these are protected features, there are certain things that you can do without having to come back to the commission. And we go through for each property and identify these protected features: the existing window openings, the existing hip roof form, the existing roof materials, with the exception for replacement with wood, slate, metal, or slate-like composite material, and insulation of solar panels, etc. And then number 2, and this is the same in every building and every property, has slightly different protected features. So number 2 are the existing features that are not protected. So the homeowner knows that they don't have to worry about this restriction if they're proposing to alter these features that are not protected. So for example, the connector building on 1 Vernon Street, it's not restricted by this restriction. So we're making it clear, and we walk through, and we're more detailed here than we were in the 2019 PR, because we want things to be as clear as possible as to what's protected, what's not protected. Again, if you want me to start, if there's a particular building you want to focus in on, happy to do it. But so again, now still with the 1 Vernon Street property, after the narrative sections, we have the visual aids, and and all of these comments are visually trying to correlate with the narrative ahead of it. And I'll tell you, it was a huge amount of work to do this, but I think if I'm a future owner living in this building 50 years from now and I'm trying to figure out what the restriction is, it's a lot easier to have this kind of guidance than if I were just left with that, right? So the goal was to make it easier for everyone to understand and to implement. And then we just walked around the building. You know, these walls are protected, but you can also put additional windows on this wall. As you can see, there are no windows on this wall, and the wall faces a neighbor like 10 feet away. So, and most of these things were allowed in the 2019 version also. These similar exceptions were provided for in that earlier draft. So we just go through and we correlate the narrative provisions with these visual aids. 3 Vernon Street is Chuck's residence. It's only the courtyard and the granite walls that are protected, so this is a pretty simple one. Here's a picture of the walls, just with annotations, just to help you understand what's allowed here. There's an exception here to allow the leveling of the wall, because this wall, if you were to walk it, you'll see it comes down on a really steep pitch. And in 2019, the commission authorized the leveling of that wall by some future owner if they're inclined to do it. I'm not sure Chuck's going to bother, but.
No, I won't.
10 Auburn Street.
Hey, Jeff,
Yes.
before you continue, you said something I just want to amend slightly, and that's that the way you described, you said something like most of these things were exemptions were based on what was in the 2019 draft. I would add or amend that to say they should all be there. I went through this thing with a fine-tooth comb, and that was a whole fun exercise, I can tell you. And so, for example, you mentioned the window openings, and I have the that 2019 draft open in front of me right now, and it's there. You know, it says, oh yeah, you know, existing window openings pertaining to existing granite foundation and stone walls, with exception for approved porch addition. Blah, blah, oh, where is it? Oh, I'm looking at the keeper's house. Sorry, on the stable. Hang on a second. Okay, there it is. Existing window openings facing Vernon Street, with exceptions for additional window openings pertaining to the size and pattern on other elevations, and removal of the existing non-contributing entry portico. So all those things are there. I mean, it's possible I would miss something, but I tried very assiduously to make sure that there wasn't any new exceptions being brought in or anything like that.
Yeah, I agree. And I tried to I made the same effort. The only reason I hesitate at all is because, like I said before, that 2019 PR had some internal inconsistencies in it, so it's hard to, you know. But I agree with that sentiment, and that's what we were aiming to do.
Okay, yeah, and I would assume so, yeah.
Okay, 3 Vernon Street, it's the granite walls, with an exception for the leveling of that wall, basically. allowing vines to be installed there as they have been for a long time. The keeper's house gets more complicated. Let me come back to that one because that's the one that involves the landscaping in the front. So let me jump to the jail property. The jail property's got a lot to it also because it involves a lot of these interior and window opening things that are unique to the jail building. Most of the exceptions here involve the work that was allowed and has already been completed. And you were out at the site walk and you, I think, saw that. So there's a whole section on the building interior elements that are protected. And, you know, they're identified as a protected feature under paragraph 1. And then the existing features not protected, there's not a lot that's not protected. Most of that building was protected. And then the visual aids associated with it.
Yeah, and just a quick comment there as well.
Yeah.
That first one not protected, you know, windows and doors. Now, typically, people might be surprised to hear that because typically, especially windows, are very usually very carefully included with things that are protected. And
Yep.
the reason is because they're usually historic windows. In this case, they are not historic windows. The historic window was thick iron bars, right? So, so that's the reason why those windows are not protected the way they usually would be.
Right, and I do want to emphasize on that point of the windows. So the window openings are protected.
Mm-hmm.
And that's important,
Right.
right? Trying to
Yes.
protect the integrity of these structures and the window openings.
Right.
Not the windows, because there weren't windows, right? But
Right.
the window openings are protected, the whole size and location.
Right.
Exception, so there was, the commission had authorized new window openings in what had been considered the dark cell. And then no restrictions as to the types of the windows, the style, material, glazing, or color. Again, there weren't windows there. So that's right. And again, I'm not trying to shortcut your review of these provisions by not walking through them now. I'm assuming that you've either had the chance to go through them or that you will, and we'll be discussing this later. I mean, if you want me to slow down and go through these in more detail right now, we can. But
Well, let's, no, go ahead. Why don't you go ahead and then we'll pause. Typically, I think we'll follow the usual pattern of, excuse me, if a commissioner has a specific question, they can ask for like a clarification, they can ask that. And then I'll see if there's any public comment, and then we can have any detailed discussion of any specific thing that is on anyone's mind, either yours or a commissioner's. How's that sound?
Yeah, sounds good. So I think it makes sense then to go right to the keeper's house, because that, again, it seems to be, oh, that's the variance decision. Oh, it's keeper house above. So, all right, the keeper's house. And the reason, again, this was controversial, it got controversial, was because in the 2019 version of the PR, there was a reference to protecting the open landscape of the keeper's house property. And when Chuck saw that language and said, yeah, that makes sense to me, he sort of interpreted open landscape the way that open space is generally used in Newburyport, which basically means keep it as an area that's open with landscaping and doesn't have additions or new structures or something like that. He never understood it to mean that you had to maintain the existing grass that's there and that you couldn't plant anything that blocked any square inch of this building. Okay, that's an extreme view, obviously. But there was a real disparity in how some commission members interpreted the 2019 open landscaping phrase. And there was some other language in there that tended to support this interpretation that some of the commissioners had back in 2021, but it was completely inconsistent with what was intended. And that's partly what drove us to realizing that we need to put some greater clarification on what's protected here in terms of landscaping in front of this beautiful building. Everyone understanding that you don't want to put a row of arborvitaes or hedges along the front, on top of this wall no one wants to completely block the view of this building, right? So we get that. So it's a question of balance. So what kind of landscaping is compatible with wanting to see the building, and what landscaping might enhance the aesthetics of the building, et cetera. So we've tried to make an effort to accomplish a balance that we think makes sense. So let me just get to the narratives. I mean, this is the, all right, let me get to the narratives. All right, so the keeper's house. Maybe I'll start with the visuals and come back to the landscaping language. So indeed, the visuals are easier, right? So, you know, the granite walls, the window holes are protected. The roof form is protected on certain pitches, but on, I think it's one pitch, I'd have to look at the language, a dormer would be allowed because there's a huge attic in this building with no light. And so it's, and there had been dormers on this building previously. And so I think we identified one roof pitch where we were proposing to create an exception. And I think this is consistent with what was approved in 2019 for a dormer. And that would be, it's actually on the northwest and the northeast and southwest facing roof surfaces. So the roof surfaces where a dormer could be added, again, subject to whatever zoning or other requirements apply, would be the pitch that faces Vernon Street and the pitch that faces the jail building, but not this pitch and not the other side. All right, lights protected, or I'm sorry, not protected. These are just features, they're not historic elements. The granite steps are protected, although I don't even think they're a historic element, but we're proposing to protect those. These lower granite walls are not the original historic walls, right? You put these in.
These lowest walls are original.
They are original.
The top wall is what I put in.
Okay. Sorry, let me just get down.
You referred to, excuse me, you referred to it as a wall. You're referring to that low, almost like a curb, right?
Yeah,
by
this curb here.
Yeah, that wall I put in.
You put in this
okay.
wall along Vernon Street.
Yes.
I see.
There was no wall. That was just a sloping flat grass surface.
Okay.
But this wall along Auburn Street was the historic wall. Is that what you're saying?
Below it, yeah, the second block down and further down is where it was when I arrived.
Okay.
And the lawns were so steep they couldn't be mown. The reason I built this is to make the lawns less steep so they could be mown.
You can see this driveway easement here to the jail building is called out. 9-foot wide drive is allowed. It's not protected. The granite chimneys are protected. Brick and plaster chimney is not protected, not a historic element. So we go through the details very carefully, trying to identify features that are either historic elements or features that we think it makes sense to protect them. So the gutters, for example, those aren't historic elements, but we've agreed to protect them with put some constraints on what you can replace them with. And specifically, Chuck is proposing to protect the existing gutters and downspouts with the exception for replacement with fiberglass, copper steel, or other non-vinyl material.
On the coping, the downspouts have to be copper or etc. Right?
Well, the gutters and existing gutters and downspouts, and then we also agreed to protect the existing cornice as to its form and profile, but allowing replacement with wood or quality composite or other man-made material consistent with current form and profile. So the appearance will be protected in perpetuity. This is just a view of the porch again, and these are elements that Chuck put in more recently, right? This is the curbing that he put in.
Yeah.
And I'll show you in the narrative how we discuss this area. And this is the backside from Vernon Street, closer, with the connector building, closer to the stable building. So those are the visual aids. The meat of it is in these narratives. And I think I'll just focus on the open character of the front yard section here, because this is where we were getting hung up before. Let me zoom this in a little, help you out. So
Yeah, and
Yep.
just to and this is good. I'll let you continue. I just wanted to preface your recitation from the new draft with the one sentence in the old draft about this. All it says is, this is D, section D, then G. Existing open landscape with exception for approved parking and landscape features, period. And that's pretty much all it says about it. So now we get to the new version.
right. So we realized from our discussion in 21 that some commission members were really concerned with obscuring the view of the building. And actually on that point, let me go back to another PR. And this is language that you're going to see when you go to all the PRs in Newburyport. This is pretty typical language that's included in the PR itself. Grantor shall similarly not make any alterations to the surrounding property that would obscure the current view of the building, such as the installation of permanent signage or trees or very large shrubs without approval of the commission. So what does it mean that would obscure the current view of the building? I mean, so this is where the language, as I was reading it and trying to answer questions, I think it's intentionally vague language, right? Because how much a building should be obscure, it's impossible to define what's meant there. But clearly, this wasn't intended to prevent somebody from planting a daylily in front of a historic home, right? I mean, that's a super extreme example, obviously. But they also clearly can't plant a tall row of green, giant arborvitaes that would completely block it. So what is allowed and what kinds of obscuring or plantings should trigger commission review? Now, I will say we were also hypersensitive to this topic, given that the commission in 2021 didn't allow any plantings, even the short row of plantings to cover the sort of exposed foundation along Vernon Street. So we wanted to be clear about what we thought was a decent balance on this topic. And this is what we came up with. The open character of the front yard abutting Auburn and Vernon Streets. So that's listed here as a protected feature. The open character of the front yard. And that's a protected feature. As follows. The commission's prior approval is required for the following. Any new structures, signage, trees, or large shrubs that would substantially obscure the view of the keeper's house from Vernon Street or Auburn Street. So as you can see, that takes the language from the other PRs and it drops it in here. But then I go on to clarify what that means. So, but the commission's, oh, sorry. I got this in single page mode here. Okay. The commission's prior approval is not required for the following. Replacement of existing lawn and plantings, although I don't think there are any plantings, with alternative ground cover, including alternative low-lying vegetation ground cover within existing lawn area between the Auburn Street sidewalk and the previously approved driveway easement area, providing access to 10.5 Auburn Street. So if a future owner wanted to replace the grassy lawn area with a clover lawn, this would allow them to do that without having to come back to the commission. Landscaping is not something the commission's concerned with unless it obscures views to the building, right? Number two, also not requiring commission review, vegetative or non-vegetative ground cover, including pavers, stones, etc., within the driveway easement area and within the upper flat area between the easement area and the keeper's house. So that's attempting to authorize the patio and that curbing sort of separation that Chuck has already installed and that we've shown you pictures of. So long as the curbing does not exceed the elevation of the keeper's house first floor. And that's what we keep tying into here. Also allowed is the curbing along the driveway and other features to define the edge of the driveway, so long as the height of such curbing or edging does not exceed the height of the elevation of the keeper's house first floor. So when Chuck put those in, he very carefully made sure that the height of those did not exceed the height of that first floor. Also allowed without further approval are low-lying plantings, small shrubs, and seasonal garden features, so long as plantings and features do not exceed a height of 6 feet as measured from the elevation of the keeper's house first floor. So if he wants to grow small shrubs, you know, that are below 6 feet, they should be allowed to do that. That's leaving a lot of view to the building. And you saw the historical photos. They had much more than that historically. This includes seasonal garden features such as trellises, pergolas, raised beds, etc., so long as they're removed seasonally. So in other words, they can put, you know, on that patio or in the front yard, sort of typical garden support structures, trellises, and the like. They can't be huge. They have to be limited to 6 feet, and they have to be removed seasonally. That's how we drafted it. Trees. I'm going to show you some images to help you understand what we're thinking of here. And this goes back to some trees that Chuck had proposed in 21. Trees are allowed so long as they are not arranged side by side or consisting of a species and or arrangement that will obscure more than 50% of the keeper's house walls from adjacent public sidewalks at planting or at maturity. And then installation of a freestanding granite post for an address sign and mailbox with the height not to exceed 5 feet from the ground level and the sign lettering not to exceed 1.5 square feet. It's pretty small. So these are things that Chuck knows he wants to do now. That's why they're in here. And they're things that we think are consistent with the intent of the original PR, and they should be things that don't require commission approval. That's our view of it. That's why we put them in here. And I'm going to show you some pictures in a second. And then it goes on, as all these other sections do, to identify certain existing features that just aren't historic elements and are elements that aren't protected here. So with respect to the trees, again, there's nothing there now, right? Prior images, some of the previous historical images, which we walked through before, he's not looking to do that. This is what he's looking to do in terms of trees. Chuck has a whole presentation on this that I didn't bother to put in here, but basically the idea here is to plant 2 trees on the Albert Street side of the keeper's house, overstory trees, not trees with low vegetation, but trees that are going to be provide, how do you want to explain it, Chuck? It's like some ambiance and shading for the building and the occupants of the building. They don't block the view. You can still, you know, how do you measure the 50%? Not totally clear, but it's a clearer definition than whether or not a plant obscures the view, right? So we try to put some greater clarity on it. And this is the view from what we think is the more prominent view. If you're looking at this building from the High Street or the Mall, 2 trees where he's proposing to locate them just isn't going to be what we would view as obscuring the building. He's also proposing a tree on the other side of the keeper's house, in front of the building connector between the keeper's house and the stable. Again, these are plants that we think will improve the aesthetics of the building, enhance the view to the building, and not obscure the building in the way that these PRs are intending to preclude or at least require a commission review for. Now, Chuck sent the tree proposals and thoughts that he had in mind to Martha McNamara, who some of you may know. Martha wrote a book years ago, and this is Martha here with Chuck's wife Jillian many years ago, I suppose. But she wrote a book related to the courthouse, from tavern to courthouse, with a focus on the courthouse here in Newburyport. And one of the commission members had previously referenced that book as suggesting that there needs to be a direct view line between the courthouse and the keeper's house. And Chuck's read the book and didn't see anything in there that suggested that. He contacted Miss McNamara. She didn't see anything. She didn't even recall putting any emphasis on any kind of view connection there. And just objectively, based on her credentials and historical knowledge here, supports the landscape changes that Chuck is proposing. This email was forwarded to you. I'm not going to read it, but you know, she doesn't think these plantings would impact the integrity of the frog pond environment. I can imagine other changes that might, but a proposed landscape design like yours that reflects early 19th century aesthetics, emphasis, symmetry, relatively small scale, sparse plantings, would in my view be appropriate. I also think that elm trees are a good choice because the town of Newburyport had replaced the original Lombardy poplars at Frog Pond with elms in 1823. So she supports it. Chuck, you know, Chuck's got an architectural eye for these things, and thinks that these plantings would only enhance it. Going back to the PR, we think other plantings, you know, plantings, everyone has their own idea of what kind of plants they want to plant, right? So we got future owners. Sorry, I'm trying to get back to the exhibit. Future owners might want to do different things, but what we're trying to do is put parameters on what they can do by right in terms of plantings in this area. And if they want to do something more elaborate, then they go to the commission, they review the planting plan with you, and you let them know if it's okay or not okay. And in that review, you go by that guideline, the guidelines that we reviewed earlier, and you work with the landowner, come up with something that makes sense, keeping in mind that you're trying to protect views to the building, but not every square inch of it. So I think I'll leave it at that for the landscaping part of it. These are the locations of the trees as he's proposing, and this was a plan that had been presented, along with some plantings along the base of that that edge, which is right here. And you can see the deteriorated foundation here is just something that he wanted to put some small plantings in front, and this preservation restriction should not require a future owner of the property to come to the commission before planting along a shabby looking foundation. It just seems like overkill. Okay. And I'm sorry if I'm sounding, I've got a little tone in my voice, and I'm trying not to, but it's in recall of the discussion we had in 2021 was kind of disturbing. And I don't expect we're going to get into any of that kind of discussion here. Just quickly, there are some revisions that I already know need to be made to this PR as it's been drafted. Pretty small stuff, small things that can be taken care of. That, you know, we're hoping that you would tonight or at the next meeting, after you've had a chance to digest things and hear from whoever you're going to hear from here. We're looking for a sort of conditional approval, such that we can, even if it's subject to making certain revisions, so that we can then forward this on to the Mass Historical Commission for their review, which could take months. But they don't review it until they know that you're okay with it, even if it's subject to further revisions. And I've sent this list to Glenn, but just quickly, there's a typo in the first paragraph that would need to be fixed. There's a subordination provision that has to be revised to reflect the fact that Chuck has a mortgage on the 3 Vernon property. So we just need to acknowledge that, and we'll need to secure, before we can execute this, a subordination agreement from the bank. That's no problem. Legal descriptions are going to take a little work because these parcels in their new form haven't been deeded out, so there's no meets and bounds description. So we would propose to work on that while MHC is reviewing this. On Exhibit G, page 57, the visual aid actually calls out a dormer on on the southeast roof pitch of the stable building, which the narrative wasn't proposing, and we're not proposing. So we need to delete that reference. And in Exhibit I, the overview and the exhibit, or the descriptions of the alterations, the sequence doesn't line up. It's really typographical stuff. Sorry, one moment. So we know that those revisions need to be made, and we're happy to make those, but it shouldn't hold up your review. With that, I'll turn it back to the commission.
Okay, thanks very much, Jeff. That was thorough and helpful, I think. So before I open it to public comment, why don't I first just check in with my peers on the commission to see if anyone has any clarifying questions at this point. This is not intended to be where we get into actual deliberation of, or concerns about any specific thing, so much as just any clarifying type question. If you do have one, just raise your hand so I can acknowledge, see if there is anyone, and if not, we can go to a brief public comment period. Not seeing any hands among the commission. Okay, and let's see if there are attendees. Yeah, I see there's an attendee with a hand up already. All right, so even though it's not legally required to have public comment, but I try to include public comment when as much as possible when appropriate. And we know that there was a member of the public that, in fact, a former historical commission member who had submitted some written commentary who may want to say something. So I will formally open a public comment period. Use the Zoom controls to do a hand raise, and we'll acknowledge you, and then you unmute yourself on your end, and usual name and address and your comment. All right, so I do see Patricia Pecknick's hand raised, and that is the person who, Patricia, just if those of you who don't know her, she was a member of the Historical Commission for a few years, and she was on the commission for some of that period that Jeff mentioned. I can't remember exactly. I think she was on, well, she can tell us for that back in the August of 19 timeframe. But anyway, go ahead, Patricia, if you're, you can speak.
Yes, good evening, Patricia Pecknick for Dove Street. I hope that you will commend Mr. Griffin, as I do, for the labor of love that the preservation, restoration, and renovation of these buildings and landscape has been for him for many years. I hope you will, acting in the best interest of the property and the public benefit of preservation, do everything in your power to finally and speedily effectuate the signing of a comprehensive PR on this property that will protect and preserve the buildings and landscape in the future through the customary and legal review process. And I hope you will listen to the following comments that I'll make about the draft PR, knowing they are made not only out of admiration for the property, but out of a need to see a legal document that fully protects the public interest. I really recognize how much work went into this document for how many years. I think there are a couple simple problems and a couple simple solutions. I appreciate, Mr. Chair, that you gave this procedural history, that the ZBA granted a dimensional variance, and as a condition stated, the applicant shall enter into a perpetual PR to preserve the existing structure and landscaping, and the term landscaping is in the variance. The variance also refers to the unique historic structures and landscaping a second time. So as I recall, when I was on the commission, the Historical Commission directed the property owners, consultants, and attorneys, I think once upon a time, Nick Cracknell may have been involved, to use the PR for 151 High, the Kelly School, as a model. And I think that was because not only was it the most recent PR, but it had been readily approved by Mass Historical and the buildings in proximity. And of course, it's much better when all the PRs have the same format and are approvable and enforceable on clear terms. My concern about the draft submitted is that it departs from that PR and all the other, some 28 of them, in a couple ways. One is the nature of Exhibit G, and the second is the alteration of some of Mr. Roloff's referred to the boilerplate PR language. So the first thing is the boilerplate language, and the language in all the other PRs said the commission will attempt to work with owners to develop mutually satisfactory solutions which are in the best interest of the property. The PR draft that I read online said solutions that are in the best interest of the owners. That's what's in the posted draft. It may have been corrected in Appendix G, but there's a big difference between the interest of the property, which is what the commission must protect, and the interests of the owners. A PR protects the property against future owners. Perhaps one will seek to expand the commercial use of the property. And, the private benefit was already sought and received in the form of the zoning relief. So the PR really has to be about the public benefit. And so in a way, the building and the grounds are the commission's client, and the public is the commission's constituency here. The second thing is the PR should state, as all the other PRs do, that the commission will apply the secretary's standards in its review. There's a phrase, will not unreasonably regulate, and I'm afraid that's much too vague. And the third thing is that, Exhibit G strikes me as too lengthy a menu of sort of guaranteed in advance exceptions. Yes, I understand that preservation restrictions do not and should not preclude future change, but they do require an applicant to submit plans for review and for the owner to accept the approvals or denials. I do see a couple PRs among those on the website for the commission that have a version of an Exhibit G, but in both cases, it was only because the property owner submitted in advance a set of architectural plans for sort of limited and imminent restoration or renovation work. So for example, on the Kelly School PR, there's an Exhibit G that consists just of architectural plans for dormers so that the school can be adaptively reused as condos. And everything else about the building exterior, including changes in fenestration, materials, windows and doors, chimneys, and so on, was listed as major and reviewable. So the boilerplate language really is, without commission approval, grantors shall not make any changes to the building, including any change in the roof lines of the building. Okay, and then there was a second PR that has an Exhibit G. It was for the Samuel Morris House on Merrimack Street, and it had very detailed plans for a specific restoration project. And I think you would find it really annoying to read through the language. It is so precise. So I'll just read a couple things quickly. On the north elevation, we plan to replace aluminum clad thermal windows installed in 2015 with wood frames and individually glazed multi-pane sashes fitted top and bottom with an interior glass panel, et cetera, et cetera. It mentions a lantern, the dimensions, the catalog, the finish, everything. And the Exhibit G should be very, very specific. It shouldn't leave it open for a future owner to install, black vinyl windows or something like that. And if a feature is protected, it shouldn't be exempt from review. I do recall the 2019 draft PR, but as it was rejected by Mass Historical, I don't believe we can refer to its authority. So I think there should be a simple description of non-historic elements that aren't protected. I don't think there can be a list of historic architectural elements that won't be protected. I think the applicant should just return to the commission and request, with specific plans, the ability to make specific alterations whenever desirable. And this and future commissions can follow the required legal process for approving alterations, including installing dormers. I do recall the controversy that Mr. Roloffs refers to from a couple years ago. I think some commissioners felt strongly that the PR draft was unacceptable because it was a little hasty or a little vague or a little sloppy. I think some people didn't want to vote to alter the landscape because the term open landscape was there and it was being interpreted in a very common sense, rational way, since the zoning variance mentioned landscaping. The commission was certainly involved in landscaping on the Cushing house. I don't think anyone would have worried about a clover lawn or such and such, but the idea that 50% of the keeper's house will be obscured is concerning to me. I do have my own notes and my own emails between me and Martha McNamara from February 2011, in which she really lauded the commission for insisting on an open landscape in our denial of the proposed granite trellis in the front. And I think it is important to have a PR in place and then to ask the applicant to come back and talk about the trees. I think some commissioners may have approved the trees back then. Maybe people want a whole forest, in front. I think the controversy was because some people on the commission felt that we were being pushed to approve a kind of a vague draft that was a little bit sloppy. And the PR has to be very extensive in its baseline documentation. This one is. I know it was a lot of work, much credit to the owner. It should be comprehensive on what exterior architectural features are protected, and I think all historic features should be. I think it should be very minimal about what is not protected. And finally, I just want to say to the commission, please protect your own time, because even with the city's best PRs, there have almost always been some enforcement things since I was on the commission. And I think since I left, the chair was involved for quite some time with enforcement on the Central Congregational Church at 14 Titcomb because the windows were being replaced and not restored. The commission had a hearing about the building of a deck on the Goodwin Hamilton House at 223 High. I know the zoning enforcement officer was involved after the PR was put on 342 Merrimack. So please protect your time going forward by making sure you have in hand an unambiguous legal document, because you will have to, by our ordinance, administer, manage, and enforce the PR. There will be a great public benefit in the continued preservation and restoration of this complex of buildings and landscapes. I think time is of the essence. It's been 4 years since the private benefit was conferred, and I hope you will act quickly and definitively to amend the draft presented so that it reflects the full scope and detail of your legal authority. I appreciate your service on the commission. This PR is very difficult, and I truly appreciate everything Mr. Griffin has done so beautifully to preserve this very special property. I know he has and will continue to have pressing and absolutely visionary plans for future changes to the property. But I also sincerely believe that his legacy will best be protected against the designs of future owners by a rigorous and very exacting PR. And I would request that the final document be reviewed by our city solicitor before being sent on to Mass Historical. Thank you for letting me speak, Mr. Richards.
Sure. You're welcome. I see one other hand. This is a little unusual. Gretchen, I see your hand up. Gretchen is our note taker, but did you want to make a public comment, Gretchen?
It's actually Thomas Joy. It's Gretchen's husband. I've been following
okay.
the meeting. I just wanted to make,
Well, can you just identify yourself and your address, please? And then...
Thomas Joy, 51 Pond Street, Newburyport, Mass. I'm sorry. And I also want to state for the record that I hate following Miss Pecknick on that. But I do think if the commission follows through with an agreement of this type, it's not in the commission's best interest. That you're basically giving away a lot of your oversight of the property. Based upon windows, based upon landscape, based upon numerous aspects of what was presented tonight. I have 35 years of experience in the trial court, and I haven't seen anything from the presentation tonight that kind of sways the opinion that they're trying to improve the property. They're basically structuring it for a future sale. And I think that should be something taken into consideration. Also, the view from the front of the property, to put anything in front of the property and to put a position where the commission cannot review anything that is a temporary structure. Well, who's going to go and tell them that, well, you have to take that down now? You know, the timing of that, it's as we all know, temporary structures become permanent structures, and then it's a different argument. But I do think that you want to look at going forward, how are you going to maintain your control over the property in the sense of what your duty is as the historical commission. That's all I have to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Joy. Okay, and those folks, you can put your hands down. See, Patricia already has. Okay, so we will officially close the public comment period. Appreciate those people stepping forward. So let me turn to my fellow commissioners. I think I've made note of, one or two things that are worthy of discussion, but I'd like to hear from you all. Hopefully you've had a chance to take a look at this at a lengthy PR. And, I think we like to strike a reasonable balance between, quote, getting it done. But on the other hand, I don't want people to feel pressured or rushed into, I think a comment was made, I think I was, Ms. Pecknick was mentioned how people may have, it was a different discussion, but may have felt, under pressure to or rushed to make a decision. I don't want anyone to feel that, but on the other hand, this has been going on a long time. I really, I'll be perfectly upfront and honest, I want to get this done, but I don't want to get it done at the sacrifice of anything that's important to the city's interests. So I'm just looking at the image of Mr. Sandrone has a very pensive look on his face. So I'm wondering, Mark, if I could start with you, if you have any thoughts or comments, anything you think we ought to address.
Well,
And
again,
we'll go by everybody.
Again, I'd like to applaud all of the efforts that Mr. Griffin has put into this property. I've known it for a long, long time, and I think what he's done is a very remarkable achievement. It's unique in Newburyport, and it's probably unique in the state insofar as that he's integrated a number of architectural features to something that is historically significant. That being said, the preservation restriction is important for such a property, but in terms of our purview, my understanding is that we look at the outside of the buildings and the surroundings and so on and so forth. And when I note that in the preservation restrictions, there are certain exceptions that take our purview of what is there out of the picture and abrogate some of the responsibility that we have, I get a little nervous. That being said, these are small details. The big picture is very important, and I don't think we should get lost into too many details. Personally, if there are trees in front, not a real big deal in my opinion, and I think that's fine, but I do not think that we should be asked to sign a document where we abrogate any of our responsibilities as a historical commission. So those restrictions, I do have some problems with.
Okay, let me make one comment here about some of the existing exceptions, because I think it's a fair criticism that, gee, there's an awful lot of exceptions, right? And someone else commented about, I think it was, again, Ms. Pecknick, that we shouldn't rely too heavily on the 2019 agreement because it was rejected by Mass Historical Commission. Well, my understanding, and I'm pretty sure this is correct, their rejection wasn't based on any of those. That content was based on the nature and structure of the PR, and that it didn't conform to the standard that they needed. And there was, some other things. The things that they were objecting to had nothing to do with the pre-approved things that were approved back in 2019. So I do, and so it relates to what you're saying, Mark. This is we're gonna have to do a little bit of a balancing act here, because the board did approve certain things. In fact, some of those things have already been executed. For example, the addition to the jail, and it was explained at the time, the reason behind it, the logic behind it. Those people who were on the tour saw how that was executed with great respect for, the jail itself and so on. So, those were laid out back then. I do think there's so I hear what you're saying about we don't want to give up any of our right to review things unless it's something that clearly was already approved, so to speak, back in 2019. And I have particularly I'll refrain for the moment on what my specific concerns are. But anyway, I just want to interject, that comment
May I
too.
respond to that for just 2
Sure,
seconds?
sure, go ahead.
I'm coming in with a fresh view of this because I was
Right.
not involved in the first one.
Right.
I have read and reviewed all the documents very carefully. And I think it is very important to make a distinction between that prior document and the document. We're asked to look
Mhm.
at the document now as it is. And I do understand the history. It was very nicely explained by Mr. Rolos. I totally get it. But I think there is still an issue with regards to our limitation in terms of the review of whatever is done or not done to the property. And I think it is all in a very well-meaning manner that the document has been put together. I think it has good intentions, but I really have a problem when we are told to not look at certain things when in fact it is our responsibility to look at all things, even though they may be details that I personally don't care that much about. But it's a matter of, I think, more principle than detail.
So quick question for you, Mark. Are you saying that for all the exceptions or just certain ones?
I look at it in the big picture. I have to say that I would trust, of course, Mr. Griffin in doing the right thing because he has done the right thing. But we do have to look at the future and consider what other people might do. And so then we get lost in the weeds. We get lost into all the details. I think we have to trust the system and the Historical Commission's ability to intervene and be consulted and have an opinion as to what is going to happen as we go along. And therefore, yes, you can quibble about the details, but I think as soon as I see restrictions, I get nervous about that because I think it really limits our responsibilities.
Okay, got it. Thank you, Mark. See who else we got here. How about Mr. Bernhardt? Any thoughts on this discussion at all?
I'm still listening.
Okay, you want to pass? You want to pass
I
for
want to
now?
pass. Yes.
Okay. How about Biff? Any thoughts from you?
Sure. Yeah. Yeah. I echo a lot already been said, but I think the one thing that really stands out to me are those areas where a future homeowner could take it upon themselves to do something that we would have no control over, or that we would have to police very carefully. And I understand that a lot of it's like, well, we wouldn't want to have to vote on whether they're going to put flowers in front of their house or whatever. But in my gut, I'm saying, actually, look, I would rather go that far and say, yes, let's have them come to us if they're going to put anything in there, and we can easily say, yo, that's not a problem, you're approved, than leaving it in a point where it's open for them to kind of do stuff that we hope is okay. And so I think that's just my concern with it. But overall, I mean, I think it's obviously important that we get something done on this, but I think it just needs to be tightened up in a way that won't leave those things open for interpretation or for some kind of wiggle room that, and yeah, and it's like even just the trees in front of it. I don't know how I feel about it. I think it's important to have a lot of trees in town, and you know, for environmental reasons and for keeping a place cool, and it can look planted correctly. I think it can look really great, but it is, you know, we want to see that house, and if there's trees in front of it, it's going to block it, and so that's something that we should be able to discuss here, right, and be able to talk amongst our group and have public come forward and say, you know, no, we don't like the idea of all those trees. So I think that's the part that I think bothers me a little bit.
Okay. All right, thanks, Biff. How about Mr. Sawtell? Any thoughts? Uh-oh. I think we
Remember,
got some.
this is
Oh, having some audio problems,
but I-
Chris. Hmm.
okay.
Yeah, Chris,
right,
we can only hear like an occasional word. Start again. Towards the end there, you sounded like you were coming in better. Try it again. All right, we'll tell you what. We'll come back to Chris. I think I heard that. Why don't we come back to you, Chris? Well, I heard yes, but very badly broken up. Very hard to make out. Wonder, might almost be worth dialing in on a phone line or something if your connectivity is really bad. But while you work on that, you guys jump over to Mr. Morgan, Joe Morgan. What are your thoughts, if any?
Yeah, I agree entirely with Ms. Pecknick's comments, and I think Mark's comments are spot on also. However, will give my expanded version of that, because it's all about being extremely verbose tonight. So I'm going to add my verbosity to everyone else's. So it seems to me that there are three issues here. Okay, one clearly is the one that we're all interested in, and that's the continued stewardship of the historic properties. There are four, I believe we're talking about four properties. Okay, here. I mean, I think I remember four numbers. I don't think that anyone questions Mr. Griffin's commitment to that continued stewardship. So I don't think we need to really talk about that other than to acknowledge it. The second issue is, how do we outline a procedure or procedures in order to review future alterations to those projects, those properties? And I'd like to read a revised paragraph 8, standards for review. This is inserted text by the applicant. The intent of the preservation restriction is to enable the commission to review proposed major alterations to the protected features and to assess their impact on the integrity of the protected feature, not to preclude future change. Okay, the commission will attempt to work with property owners to develop mutually satisfactory solutions that are in the best interest of the owners, while balancing those interests with the purposes of the restriction. Now, it's saying two things, and it's extremely confusing. On the one hand, it wants to extend to NHC a trust and an acknowledgement of our duty also. Okay. However, it takes it back from us. It takes it back from us immediately. And it does that by referring to protected features that have already been a priori designated. It doesn't actually enable us, it abrogates, as Mark said, it abrogates our power through this Exhibit G. Because this is the same paragraph where they have added restrictions and guidelines included in Exhibit G, and they have suppressed, deleted, our requirements to follow the Secretary of the Interior standards. So this paragraph is about taking away what our authority by ordinance is, and that is to review projects. Okay. The third item is the legal instrument, which is this PR. Okay. And I find that clearly, we all find it, that's the most challenging of all of this. Okay. So let me tell you what I found in reading the PR. My first question is, shouldn't there, because there are 4 properties, why shouldn't there be 4 PRs? If each property is possibly going to change ownership in the future, don't we want a PR that can be recorded with the deed for that property, with the property, it goes with the property, it follows the property. Don't we want a separate PR? Okay, missing paragraphs. They're missing insurance. Does the owner have insurance on any of these properties? And why wouldn't it continue? Why wouldn't we be guaranteed through the PR that insurance will be held for the assessed value of the properties? 12, indemnification of our role as grantees. Okay, so that we are not held, so that we're held harmless through our duties as city commissioners. Okay, and then 29, which is deleted, that is the subordination of prior liens. Someone already mentioned that. And that would be mortgages and mortgagees' response to all of the properties, and not just now, but in the future when things change. There's a truncated paragraph, paragraph 18. Okay, the notice of a proposed sale does not mention NHC. In the standard templates, we are involved in order to inform prospective buyers of their obligations and their rights in purchasing the historic property under PR. And then back to revised paragraph 8. And I've just basically described what those are, but I believe the real problem is Exhibit G. Exhibit G should really be folded into the baseline documentation. All language to protected and non-protected should be deleted. And that's because protected and non-protected, as it's used, does abrogate the commission's power. It implies that there have already been decisions made by us, even though in a passive way if we sign this document, and that we will have no future, believe me, we would have no future power to change those if it's included into the agreement today or in the near future. I don't think it takes anything away from the intent of the document to include all of the language relative to protected and non-protected as simply original historical elements or materials or non-historical elements or materials, basically to define, as is the intent of the Mass Historical Commission and through its PRs, the exact scope of the historical property that is being documented. Okay. I feel, in summary, I feel that the document, even though intends to fulfill the stewardship requirements going forward, I believe that it's not fair to the NHC. It does not adequately respect our role in this. And I don't believe the Mass Historical Commission would allow it to be, those powers to be taken away or diminished. They do depend on the local commissions who understand these properties and do review them in order to be sort of the avant-garde. They rely on us to make these decisions, and I advise that we do not accept this until the paperwork is in order. It was sloppy last year, and I have to say it's still sloppy. Okay, so thank you very much.
Hang on a second. just wanted to, one quick question for you, Joe. Did I understand you correctly? If I want to summarize one of the things you said, that rather than have this lengthy list of exceptions following each thing that's protected, I think you're suggesting that if we spell out specifically what is protected, that alone is sufficient, because by definition, we've spelled out what's protected, and if something isn't spelled out in there, it's not protected. Is that a fair translation, or not?
No, the word protected is not to be found in other PRs. I don't even understand where it came from, protected and non-protected. What we need is baseline documentation. That is the core of the PR. And if the language is revised to indicate the historical scope of the existing property that's being documented, okay? Well, in other words, as has been done, I think Mr. Griffin did a good job in his exhibit E, I believe it was, and I think F would be the photographs that would supplement it, but basically saying, well, what did we find? What is the baseline is actually time zero. It's at when we issue the PR. What is the state of the property at that point? Okay, and then and I think Mr. Griffin did a good job of indicating what work had already occurred before he became owner of the property, and therefore which projects that had been performed prior to his ownership that were not part of the original structure. Okay, so it's not a question of protected versus non-protected. It's a question of what is the original historical building? What is it? And I think it's there. All of it is there. It's just the way it has been phrased in order to protect his rights as an owner to proceed without future interference from NHC. And that's the way I read the document. And I don't think that's acceptable. I don't think that's in the spirit of the preservation restriction. I don't think it would be accepted by the Massachusetts Historical Commission.
Okay, I'll respond to one or two things, and then I'll also maybe give Jeff a chance to respond to some things too. The first thing is, and Jeff, you can talk to this. I think that the technical details, legalistic details you mentioned, like for example, indemnification, insurance, and subordination, so on. I know we caught the subordination one, and they're going to add that. Jeff, are you familiar with the insurance provisions and indemnification? I know those usually are in PRs. Were you aware that those appeared to be absent?
Yeah, but I think they were absent from the 2019 version, which is why they're absent from this one.
I see. Well, okay. All right. Well, we'll have to. I think that I think Mr. Morgan is correct. I'm sure that Mass Historic would insist on that as well. So those are a couple of things that we'll need to, in fact, if you have a list of those in writing. I was taking notes as quickly as I could, Joe, but I might not have caught everything you were mentioning there. The other thing was that I want to just comment on is, why are there not 4 separate PRs? First of all, it's a good question. I think it started out as one PR historically because of the fact of the unique relationship among those 3 structures. The 3 structures, you're correct in that there are 4 lots, but only really 3 structures. One of the lots, the 4th lot, is it has nothing to do with the jail. It's a separate property. It just so happens that some of the historic jail walls, excuse me, the tall granite walls with the spikes and all that, happen to lay on that lot. So therefore that lot comes into the picture because those are protected. So maybe I think that was part of history of it. I did talk to the Mass Historic people, well, specifically Steinitz. You've heard his name mentioned before. He's the guy that oversees the reviewing of these things. And I asked him about, is it okay or normal or whatever to have, one PR for these for what are technically 4 lots, and because they're different structures. And he said, yes, it's not uncommon. It is done. It really, it's whichever way we want to do it. I would think, and Jeff, maybe you know the answer to this. To your concern about where this is recorded, I would imagine it would have to be recorded with, with each deed for each lot. That might be part of the work that Jeff alluded to, as far as because the lot lines have changed and all that. There's some new, I believe you used the term meets and bounds that got to be done. So at any rate, there's a bunch of registry related stuff that would probably have to happen there. And aside, any other, Jeff, do you have any quick comments on any things that I said just now, relevant to the some of the legal requirements of this?
And I don't think in response to what you just said, I mean, we did it as 4 parcels because it was one complex of buildings interconnected. So
Yeah. Okay.
if we get one of these to a point, if we actually manage to draft one for one property that's acceptable, maybe we could do duplicate versions for the others. But like, why? It would this as a sort of complex, it would get recorded against each property, and each owner would be bound to it with their with respect to their own property. And Michael Steinitz seemed fine with that.
Yeah, he was.
I mean, I guess I would say my suggestion would be, let's try to wrap this up as one. And if Michael Steinitz thinks it should be divvied up then, but we have the language right, then we do it at that point. It might be easier. Although some of these provisions were tailored to the fact that it was more than one, but we could probably change that and split it up into 4. But I wouldn't want to make, that's just a huge effort, especially where we haven't even gotten the language of one where it's acceptable.
Yeah.
Can I just ask clarification on the protected versus not protected, and Mr. Morgan's suggestion on that? Is the suggestion that we should be identifying what features what are the historic elements? I think that was the phrase that was used in the 29 PR. So we could, but that's just it's just semantics. I mean, for whatever's a protected feature, it could easily be called a historic element. Is that what you're getting at? I mean, I know you've got a separate comment with respect to the exceptions, but in terms of the phrasing of it, because I do want to make the point, like there are a lot of features in these buildings that are not historically part of the buildings. Like none of the windows, the roofing, like the forms and the granite walls, those are original. Those are the historic elements. Everything else has been replaced for the most part. I mean, everything else on the exterior is recent. They aren't historical elements. So we've actually proposed some of the protected features aren't historic elements. But if you want, we could do a list of what in each building is an historic element. That's all that you should be protecting legally. I don't think you have a mandate. You certainly don't have an obligation or a mandate to regulate the protection of windows that were installed 5 years ago.
I think if you read the other PRs, and that's where I draw my comments from. I compare it line by line to the other PRs because that's what we like. Because I mean, this is a lot of legalese, and the only way you can really understand what's missing or what's been added is to compare to other PRs. Other PRs start out in the whereas stuff by giving a description of the property. And that's really the standard. Now, I don't see any problem with providing as part of the baseline descriptions or the baseline documentation along with photographs, more detailed explanatory notes on the components of the building and the specific components that are historical or non-historical. But what I object to is using the language protected, non-protected, because then that is asking us to sign off on those elements now for future contingent projects, which are not being reviewed at this time. If there is a specific project that you want us to review, then I'd have to be, I'm a little bit perplexed how that would happen right now, since we have not completed the paperwork on the PR. But the intent of the PR is for you to come back to NHC, describe your project, and review the merits of that project relative to the baseline documentation. That's the intent. Okay.
Right, but if a future owner wants to replace, let's just take the window example, right? In our draft, the type of the window that's in there isn't a protected, what we call a protected feature. Okay, we could also say it's not a historic element. So alterations to windows, therefore, shouldn't come to the commission. If a future owner wants to swap out the windows and they're not changing the whole location in the granite wall, they shouldn't have to come to the commission. It's not a historic element that that a homeowner should have to submit to you for approval, right?
Why would there be an
Do you agree with
objection?
that?
No, I don't. Why would there be an objection to coming to the NHC about that?
Because they're proposing to alter an element of the building that has no historic value.
Present it to the NHC. Present it and let us tell you that's okay. What's the problem with that? In other words, what you're trying to do is remove NHC involvement, and then I think that's contrary to the intent of the PR. That's all I'm saying. Simply, that's all I'm saying. That's what I'm saying right there.
Yeah.
Right,
Well, I'm sorry. It's going to interject. Joe, you're correct, and that was overtly stated. That I know that one of the goals was to simplify, to try the. My understanding. Let me start with that. My understanding that one of the goals was to try to make things more clear and more simple for potential future owners. In that, for example, if you just had some ordinary house that had no PR, you would have no need to come, even an old house. Let's say, you had a 1820 house and you wanted to replace the windows, you wouldn't have to come to the historical commission for that. It's not a roof line change. It's not a demo thing. It's unless I'm gravely mistaken, you don't need NHC approval for that. So the thought was, well, so therefore, why would we were required here, as long as the historic fabric, that is the orientation, location, and size of the window openings isn't changed? Does that alter your opinion at all, specifically as far as this example of the windows? In other words, it's not giving them any rights that they wouldn't have ordinarily in some other circumstance.
So there's a boilerplate document, right? I forget which appendix it is, but it basically allows for minor alterations and maintenance. And I think that list probably has been the list that's been revised in the past. If there are certain things that we wanted to include on it, such as if everyone was in agreement about those items, those things. But I think that my own feeling is that's mixing another task with what we're trying to do. I think as Mr. Roloff said, I think what we're trying to do is get the language of the and the form of the PR, get an agreement on that. The other items, the specific items, I'm not so concerned with. I think as Mark said, geez, I don't really care if there are trees in the front lawn or not. We can talk about that. Those are details. All of these are details, if you wish. What I object to is the fact that the commission is being removed from the process, and that's not permissible. We cannot, I don't believe that if that's going to be acceptable. It's not acceptable to me, and I don't know if it would be acceptable to my fellow commissioners or to MHC. Okay.
Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, can I just respond again? I know we're
Yeah.
getting to it here, but there's a perception that these exceptions are abrogating your authority. You don't have a mandate to regulate every aspect of a building that's subjected to a PR. Your mandate is actually controlled by the PR that the landowner and you agree to. So going back to the windows, if the windows are not historic windows, they're not like, what do you call it? Like 6/6, like that's not the historic format or whatever, the window itself. If the historic element is the hole and the placement in the granite, right? This PR is giving you the authority to prevent modifications to that historic design. It's authority that you don't have currently. By saying that the future owners don't have to come to you if they want to swap out the windows, it's not taking anything away from you. It's just not giving you as much. But so it sounds to me like what you want to do is you want to put a PR, you want to preserve and regulate alterations to aspects of these properties that have nothing to do with the history of the buildings or the properties. Like take the connector building between the stable house and the keeper's house. Didn't even exist until Chuck bought the property. So if a future owner wants to change the roof on that component, the way we drafted it, they don't have to come to the commission. And I know to you, it seems like, what's the big deal? Just come in and meet with us. It's a big deal hiring a lawyer or an engineer or somebody to draw up a plan. Like, coming to you is not easy. It's not painless. It's a significant burden to the point where people probably will defer maintenance or work or alterations or improvements because they don't want to have to go get approval for it. So the connector building, is the commission thinking that should be the subject of the restriction? Listed as a historic element?
Well, just let me put this question to you then. If the PR describes the structures that are protected and the connector building is not listed among the protected structures, why do we need to, have a whole, why do we need to, well, dwell on it, for lack of a better phrase? It's not covered by the preservation restriction, period, whether
Yeah.
it's, the roof or anything else.
I get it. The Exhibit G could include less words because it wouldn't identify the features
Yeah,
that are not historic elements.
Yeah,
But the reason we have it there is just to make it clear, so there's not
Yeah.
an ambiguity. That's all.
Yeah.
The extra words are for clarity.
Yeah, I was in the back of my mind, I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but I think I always had a concern that this situation would arise where, I I hate to say this, Chuck, but in a sense, it's like hoisting yourself by your own petard in a way, because I totally understand why you want to spell out things that are, not subject to review. It's almost like this whole Exhibit G is like that one page, what's major and minor page that all the PRs have, and blowing it up until this huge Exhibit G thing, right? And with the goal of being very explicit and specific, and of course it's also going to be bigger because there's 4 properties, etc. And so that any future property owner can just take a look at this and in maybe 9 cases out of 10 be able to determine accurately whether something had to be reviewed or not. But the way it's coming across is like, I think at one point someone expressed it as, geez, it seems like there's more exceptions than there are things covered. It reads more like a non-preservation restriction, and it's not. I understand what you're saying, Jeff. It does, like you're quite correct. It gives the NHC or the city authority to regulate things that it does not currently have without the PR. So that's correct. It does do that, and So we need to resolve this somehow. Unfortunately, I don't have the magic wand or magic bullet that of words that it knows how to do that. But do you understand what I'm saying?
I totally do. I mean, I think I think the way to move it forward, we're talking in general the perceptions here, and that's not going to help in a situation where Exhibit G was drafted really carefully and very thoughtfully as to what elements are actually have historic value that should be protected. And then, I mean, I think that the exercise involves maybe you have a subcommittee or just the member, whoever wants to take it on, is going to have to go through Exhibit E to understand the history here and understand what part the Exhibit E informs why certain things aren't protected, because a lot of the stuff here was built by, in recent years. Okay, that's one thing. Two, it's exception by exception. I don't think it's not going to get us anywhere to say there are too many exceptions. Like, go into it and think about each one and think about why you think there shouldn't be an exception for whatever we identified. And then let's talk about that, because I think if you go one by one and think about it the way Chuck and I were talking through it, you're going to start to understand the justification for it, for each of these things. And it's not just, we're not trying to abrogate authority. I mean, that the phrase even is just, we're trying to limit it. We're trying to give you authority over the things that are historically important. And Chuck's not willing to, though, just give you authority to regulate every change of every feature at these buildings and require these future owners to come to the commission every time they want to swap out a window or fix their roof or whatever. Those guidelines, the standard guidelines attached to PRs, if you print the 25, like I did, and you pull each of those guidelines out, you'll see that they actually vary. But a lot of times they also include stuff that's so vague, and it's like we shouldn't use them just because that was what was used before. If you read them, they provide hardly any guidance at all. And if you just took the standard one from like the Kelly School and plopped it into this PR, most of it wouldn't even be applicable. It provides no guidance at all, so we shouldn't use it just because it's in another PR. It's going to be really hard to move forward, I think. I mean, we actually, unless somebody spends the time that we did at our end to think through each of these elements and each exception, and and we're happy to have meetings to discuss this if that's the most efficient way to do it. But the general response to it's too many exceptions and you're taking authority away from us isn't helping me to know what to do. I don't know. We're not gonna get anywhere.
I hear you. In fact, and I'm gonna make a note about your. My initial feeling toward your suggestion is positive as far as maybe a subset of the commission have a little working group to try to work through some of this.
And I'll also add, like, I would love to see, and maybe Ms. Pecknick wants, maybe she has this at her fingertips, or any of the commission members, or maybe staff. But where in the secretary's standards or mass law or the city's ordinance, what's supporting this view that you have a mandate to regulate all aspects of a historic building? Because the way I read these laws, it's the standard of review for the projects that come to you are, how will this alteration impact the historical elements, the aspects of the building that are significant, right? Those are what you're looking to protect. It's not all the other stuff.
Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Yes, is that Mark?
Mark Sendron. I'm afraid there's a little confusion here because we're talking about regulating when in fact all we're saying is that the Historical Commission has a responsibility to review whatever is presented. If this document tells us what is to be and not to be reviewed, then that is not the way it works. We're not trying to regulate. We just have for role and for responsibility to review what we think is important in terms of preservation and standards that exist. We're not trying to tell you what to do, what not to do. And we're not here also to tell you and Mr. Griffin that your details are right or wrong in terms of protection. All we want to do is have the ability to look at this down the road and say, well, hey, this is not historically significant, and we're not going to have to review it. It's plain and simple. So the amendment, the G exhibit is maybe not necessary. It really isn't, because it's our responsibility to look at that in the first place. So if somebody wants to make a change in 20 years, doesn't matter. We'll look at it and we'll make a comment about it. I think that's the way it's not an interpretation. That's our responsibility. That's what we do as the Historical Commission. And so I think Mr. Morgan has a very good point. If you want to list what's there, then that's fine. At least we know that it's there. But to limit what we have the purview of making recommendations upon is not acceptable.
Well, Mark, this is Glenn. Let me interject something. And you probably know this, that all the PRs have an equivalent exhibit called, where it defines what's major and minor, because, for example, replacing, let's say, wood clapboards, replacing them in kind, right, is considered, or, let's say there's a section of wall that's rotted and you need to replace, do a repair and with in-kind materials so that the appearance is going to end up the same. They do specify that you do not need to come to have that approved because it's considered a minor change. In other words, all these PRs have it is vague, I'll admit that, but they do have some guidance as to, for example, if it was a case of a house that's painted, if you want to, change the paint color, whatever, you're allowed to do that without prior review. So it's not unprecedented to have definition as to certain things being permitted without prior review. And that, you know what I mean? That's always part of these things. Is that not your understanding? Because that's my understanding. And I think that if you look at any PR, you'll see that.
Yeah, no, I understand that.
Okay. So how would you what would you suggest, how would you suggest we handle that equivalent thing in this case, as far as major and minor changes? Because I think at the bottom line I think if I understand Chuck's motivation is that he would like to avoid, not just him but future owners, avoid having to go to the commission for something that's considered a minor change that's not going to have a deleterious historic impact.
Totally understood, but I think what Mr. Morgan expressed was pretty much how I felt.
Okay, so does either one of you have a thought as to how that would be expressed in instead of this elaborate exhibit G, something that's more simple and straightforward?
Can I speak up, Andrew? I mean,
yes.
I think we should go back to what we've always done is, does it alter the historical significance of the property? And they keep on saying non-historic pieces. Those are probably the most important things, because when they alter a property, they alter it with non-historic assets that might deter from the property itself. So, I mean, for the past year and a half, I sat in meetings and it all comes down to historical significance.
Mm-hmm.
And to say something that you could change something that's not historically significant with another like makes sense, as long as it's like and not different.
Mm-hmm. Well, the secretary's guidelines, and I don't disagree with you necessarily, Andrew, but even historical features, if you can repair those using, you know, the language of something like, you know, like materials and workmanship and so on, you know, that's permitted.
I like
because
that. I agree with that. And
Yeah.
I,
Yeah, well, that's in the guidelines. That's in the secretary's guidelines.
exactly, it's then, the
For the very
exception
reason,
I'm concerned
yeah,
about is
yeah,
replacing the exception with an exception. If it's similar to the exception that we granted, fine, but if it's different, I mean, you know, maybe they're putting in purple windows. I don't know.
okay. Ed, you haven't said anything, and I know that this is a little bit of a new to you as far as since you're a very new member, but since you're here, just did, you know, if you did have anything you'd like to say, you're welcome to contribute it.
Yeah, well, yeah, thanks, Glenn. It's a little overwhelming, this one. But I appreciate the comments by Mark and by Joe very much. And I don't know if I'd say agree, but I have a sense of agreement with the comments. And but yeah, otherwise it's a little bit overwhelming. There's a lot here and a lot of history that it's still challenging for me.
All right, well, let me ask this.
To make anything, yeah, I think that Andrew's last comments were also very valid. Sometimes there's been a lot of talking. We've been on the phone for a long time here, and we've got to break it down to its most basic elements. And this, you know, Andrew's comments thing was just, you know, break it down to historical significance. I think we're trying to boil a couple of oceans, and we just got to kind of, you know, get it back down to something that's a little bit more straightforward.
Yeah. Okay.
I think this has got. I think maybe it's a little inflated. I don't know right now.
Yeah. I think I have an idea how we can wrap this up, but for tonight anyway. But before I do, I just want to check back in with Chris Sautel. Were you able to get? Why don't you try your audio one more time, Chris, so we can hear if you have anything to say before I make my suggestion as to how we might try to wrap this up tonight.
Hi.
Yeah, hi. Oh,
All right.
you're all chopped up, Chris.
Oh, let me try this just a minute. All right, how's this? Is that better?
Yeah, it is better actually.
Okay, yeah. All right. Remember, and looking at this PR for the old jail, it's very intense, so to speak. A comment that I had concerning the windows. It's just my own opinion. They must have no historical significance. Yes, if they're new, they don't have historical significance because they're not original. However, if you look to where the windows are, they're right in the middle of PR, and therefore I believe that that's an important thing, and that's just an observation that I have. And that's it.
All right, thanks, Chris. It sounds it was still a little bit broken up, but it sounds like you're concerned about the windows and maybe we shouldn't quite write them off completely. Is basically how we'd kind of paraphrase it. What I'm thinking is, I think Jeff's suggestion has some merit, and I wonder if maybe two other members of the board would like to get together. I think maybe first, well, let me think. Well, what do you think? Would it, I'm debating whether to meet with Jeff, or first confer amongst ourselves and then meet with Jeff. Any thought? Well, first of all, would anyone be willing to volunteer to participate in that? would, like, I know that, I think Mark and Joe are probably the most, had the, you had a very well thought out opinions and points on this. So you're likely candidates, but I don't want to volunteer you. I see Mark, I see your hand up. Does that mean you're, quote, putting your hand up to volunteer?
Partially, but also making a suggestion that if
Yep.
indeed the exhibit G could be amended to just list what is considered to be historically significant or important, I'm okay with that. But to say what is not allowed for us to look at is, in my mind, not really acceptable. So I think if the exhibit G could be revised and the wording revised, I think that might be a good place to start.
I could augment that by suggesting as an alternative that exhibit G be eliminated and that E and F take its place. If we do a really solid baseline documentation per the requirements for PRs, I believe you're covered. I think G would just be redundant.
Okay, eliminate G, and what would be covered by which other exhibits, Joe?
The historical explanation of the evolution of the various components of the jail complex, and then in F is basically photographs of the all of the existing conditions. It's
Okay,
an existing conditions survey, but annotated as an exhibit E, showing when various original structures were altered and or added onto. So I think, tell the history of the jail complex, show which structures arrived on the site and how they were transformed. And I believe that's been done in the sort of the photo or the graphic essay that Mr. Griffin put together, and then accompany it with the photographs in exhibit F. And that should be sufficient.
Joe, would you be willing to have a get together with maybe Mark and myself to look at how exhibit G might either be greatly simplified or
Yes.
potentially even eliminated? And what I'm thinking is
Yes.
maybe the three of us could do that, and if we come up with something that we think does the job, then we can, Jeff, we can get back to you, and I think we could do that relatively expeditiously. And if we can, in the meantime, you've got some other things you can work on, like the those missing. Joe, do you have it in writing, those missing pieces? Because I think those are legally important. We know about the subordination one, but the other one's about indemnification, the commissioners and all that, and the insurance and all that good stuff. Did you happen to make a notation of which what those things were that? Unless Jeff, you know what
I'll
those
send
are.
an email to you. I'll send an email to you.
Okay. All right. So we don't have to. All right. So why don't we? Unless anyone objects, if anyone has a strenuous objection to that, raise your hand. If I don't see any in the next few seconds, I'll assume that. What I'll do is, rather than take up more time tonight, Mark and Joe, I'll contact you to set up a meeting time that we can do it. It's unfortunately, it won't be in the next couple of days because I've got one trip coming up starting tomorrow, and then almost all next week I'll be out of town. So but it can be right after that. But we'll work that out to all our, mutual schedules and so on.
Mr. Chairman, just
Yes,
quickly,
who's speaking?
The process sounds fine. I just want to highlight, though, like you had mentioned, I mean, the 2019 PR version that was approved by this commission explicitly included a lot of exceptions. So as you're working through this effort, let's not ignore the fact that the previous commission in 2019 already approved a PR that had a lot of exceptions in it. So I don't think we're willing to accept one that just erases all of those.
Yeah, I understand. Yep, I understand. We can certainly. I will not. I will believe me. I won't be able. I won't forget that. I think that'll be impossible. But yeah, understood. Just wanted, the only, okay, I want to move on as the hour grows late. The only update I have as update from the chair is that we have yet another new member that is poised to potentially join. His name is Alan Markey, Marquis. His nomination will be before the City Council on August 14th, so he would be another alternate member. So that's exciting. We'll be full up with 7 regular and 2 alternate members. So we'll see how that goes. And the only other items are the approval of the minutes from the 13th of July. I know there was some email about a correction. I believe that correction or not, or amendment, which I believe was made. Joe had requested an amendment. Is there a motion to approve the amended minutes from the 13th of July?
Motion to approve the minutes.
Is that Andrew?
Yep.
Okay, thanks, Andrew. Okay, is that seconded?
I'll second that. This is Biff.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Biff. Okay, so your vote on that, Andrew?
Yes.
Okay, Biff?
Yes.
Okay, Mark, you were not here so we'll mark you as abstaining. Joe Morgan?
Yes.
Okay, Ed Neumer, you were here.
Yes.
Okay, and Chris Sotel, I believe you were absent that time too, so we'll mark you as an abstention, and the chair is an affirmative on that. So that makes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 affirmative votes. So we're good on that. Does anyone else have any other pressing business other than adjournment?
Motion to adjourn.
Okay.
Mark.
Yeah, I recognize the voice, Mark. Thank you. Is that seconded?
Seconded, Mr. Baus.
Okay, I recognize Mr. Biff. Baus, okay, your vote on that, Mr. Bernhardt.
Yes.
Okay, Mr. Baus,
Yes.
Mark Cendrone.
Indeed, yes.
Okay, Joe Morgan.
Yes.
Okay, Ed Neumer.
Yes.
Okay, Chris Sotel. Oh,
Yes.
hey,
Yes,
we
yes,
got you.
I got it. I hear you.
Yes, we heard you. Okay, so we're unanimous in that. We'll have to figure out what's going on with your audio for future meetings, get that squared away. And Joe and Mark, I will be in touch to try to set something up. Actually, I'll try to set it up, at least get it on the calendar before I go away anywhere. Okay, well, thank you all very much. Sorry it went
Good
this
night,
long, but
gentlemen.
it's a big thing. But it'll be, it's moving. As long as we keep it moving, we can get it done. Thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Chair.
Okay, good night, everybody.
Right.
Good night.
Good night.